Hi, I got a question for you. How many leadership books do you own or have you read? I've got lots of them. Looking at my library over here, I probably have, I don't know, 50 books on leadership. I'm toying around with the idea of throwing them all away. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about why all the leadership books get it so wrong. And if there's anything that we can learn from people that study leadership and then try to tell us how to be leaders. I want to start like we do always with the news and analysis. And I want to talk about what if you had a leader of a country that wanted to take over? Don't get nervous. I'm not talking about Republicans or Democrats. I'm not going to talk about Donald Trump or all the anti-Trumpers out there. I want to talk about the South Korean president. I'll try to get his name right, Yoon Suk Yeol. And he had a gambit he tried last year in December, trying to declare martial law and seize power and consolidate more power around the office of a duly elected president. So it didn't work. That's the end game. It didn't work. But let's talk a little bit about why it didn't work and what we can learn about leadership from that. So news and analysis, human performance. We're going to talk about December 2024. The South Korean president declared martial law for about 3.5 hours. And then he backtracked as protests erupted and parliament rebelled. And it's really a masterclass on leadership failure. And it's a reminder to me that leadership books often miss the mark. And this, I guess you could call it a crisis, didn't last long, but it really isn't about a bold move or a charismatic leader. What I think experience tells me, leadership is defined by followership, right? And we hear a lot of talk these days about cult-like followership. I think those are rhetorical terms, but for sure, followership can be weak and tepid, or it can be extremely powerful, right? To the point of being over the edge. And I think in the case of the South Korean president, he misread the room, right? He misread the room. He hadn't established the trust, right? He hadn't established the context, right? He wasn't adaptable with his plan. It was this way or that way. I'm declaring martial law. That's kind of an all-in-one strategy, right? So as a result of that, he not only rescinded the order after Parliament voted 190-0 to reject it, he now faces impeachment and investigations, something we're used to over here in the United States now, far too used to. So a leader has to be cognizant of the level of his, and this is going to be a funny word we'll talk about a little bit, but the level of his power, right? How much can your declaration or even the authority that you've been given command of others? Because without followership, there is no leadership, right? If you act alone without consulting anybody, right? In this particular case, he didn't consult his party. He didn't consult the military. He didn't take any polls. He just did what he wanted, right? And I just wonder if somewhere down the road he hadn't, or in the past, he hadn't read a leadership book about boldness in action and being a visionary. There's a difference between being a visionary and being an authoritarian, right? And there are times in true national emergencies where martial law and authoritarianism might be the only thing that saves the day. But this was not the case. South Korea was doing just fine. So what were the leadership sins that the president of South Korea committed? Well, clearly he had no stakeholder buy-in, right? He acted alone. He alienated his closest allies, right? I think a lot of the books talk about being a bold visionary, but real leadership takes coalition building. Sin number 2, I think the dude had zero emotional intelligence, right? And sometimes when you get on that pinnacle, right, and you are, especially in that part of the world where authority is greatly respected, right, you still have to be able to respect the fact that, he was about to create public trauma and anger, right? And he, a lot of books out there talk about authenticity. He might have been very authentic to who he was and what he wanted, but that authenticity kept no one loyal, right? Sorry about the boinging in the background there. I was just getting another call. And you need loyalty because you need followership. Sin number 3 is he ignored feedback. Just as he was getting ready to do this, his advisors warned him not to do this, right? There was a lot of dissent in his immediate circle of people. Great leaders thrive on dissent. And that's why this failure was so unnecessary, because he had people telling him where his blind spots were, but he did it anyway. I'll give you a little real world data here. 2025 Gallup poll says that 76% of employees ditch leaders who lack empathy, right? People that don't think about what their actions are going to mean to their employees or their close circle. Right? And President Yoon, who wasn't in high public regard at the time, but his approval ratings tanked, obviously, overnight. So what does leadership really take, right? It's an evolving process in my mind, and they don't really teach this in any of the leadership books I have. I mean, they talk about pivoting, right? Pivoting is really a constant form of adaptation, right? There's never a rigid framework. I just read a book that compared transactional leadership with transformational leadership, and arguing that transactional leadership, which is getting the job done, making transactions that are right in front of you, that's so old school. Transformational leadership are what the real leaders do. They can change and move things for the better. Well, I've been in a lot of leadership positions, and I'll tell you 85% of my time is transactional leadership. Keeping the trains running, making sure people get paid, keeping the HR pipeline going, taking care of people, places, things, airplanes, all kinds of stuff. It's all transactional until there's a need for it to be transformational, when you need to change. Okay? And then during that period where you're being a transformational leader, you still have to conduct the transactions, right? You still have to keep the trains on the track. Okay? So I think in this analysis, this little case study, what we've seen here is that somebody who probably had all kinds of advisors and all kinds of leadership training, and I'll bet you had more than a few leadership books on his shelf, didn't do him any good when it came down to making a decision that's going to impact him for the rest of his life, and probably eroded a good bit of trust in his government and the people of South Korea. So, Yoon's martial law blunder by ignoring his stakeholders, not having any empathy, not seeking and embracing dissent, kind of explains why, and this is a classic big mistake, but we all make little mistakes in our family leadership and things like that. But it explains that when we try to oversimplify something that's messy, like all human performances, we've talked about that before, maybe it's time we forget the guru books, right? Maybe it's time we take a little bit deeper look at our everyday leadership decisions to see what we can learn about it for ourselves, where we are with the resources that we have. And so that's why I'm thinking about getting rid of all my leadership books. But I probably won't. And now that I'm talking about it, I'll probably go back and look for more areas that I think are flawed, or maybe even some good stuff. Every leadership book that I have tries to sell me a half truth or a fantasy, right? Books by their very nature, and I write them so I know this, they're outdated the minute you put them into publication. Why? Because you wrote them in the past. Books, I know it because I write them, are oversimplified. Gosh, I've got 258 elements of professionalism that I wanted to talk about in my book, Going Pro, The Deliberate Practice of Professionalism, available on Amazon for $21.95. Makes a great gift for back to school. But here's the deal. I couldn't put 258 things in there. So I had to crystallize it down and oversimplify it. Right? And yet you put out a book and people read it, and they think they now have the level of knowledge that the author had, and they probably even get some Cliff's Notes out of it, and they take 3 lessons out of a 500-page book that could have easily been a 1,500-page book, right? So the depth of knowledge when you read books just gets crystallized down to sometimes meaninglessness, and I hope that's not the case in mine. But the bottom line is idealistic formulas don't survive contact with reality. Okay? Again, leadership is messy, it's contextual, and it's human. And no book or guru, including myself, who I do not consider to be a guru, can ever contextualize that for you. They can't capture that for you. They don't live where you are. They don't think like you do. They don't work with the people you work with. Right? So for the next couple of minutes, and this will be a short one, I want to debunk a few myths. I want to expose a few flaws, and maybe offer a raw, practical approach on what leadership actually demands of all of us here in the 21st century. Is that what we're in? Here's myth number 1, the universal formula, right? The GE way by Jack Welch, right? Or how Steve Jobs made Apple, right? And those things are better viewed as biographies, right? Historical biographies, than they are guidance, right? Context is everything. I know about leading a startup. That has nothing to do with Jack Welch and how he got more shareholder wealth in a Fortune 100 company. Okay? You can look at, even within the same industry, you've got Steve Jobs, who is, by all accounts, extremely abrasive. And then you've got Satya Nadella, who basically saved Microsoft. And his was completely empathic, team decision-making. I don't really know what's going on here. Please explain it to me. And both worked, right? Both worked. Why? Because they mapped, I think, the leadership capability within that individual with the context and demands of the moment, right? So universal formulas do not work. So that's myth number 1. Myth number 2, leadership is heroic. The books about leaders glorify leaders as infallible visionaries or rogue, heroes. Here's the deal, man. Great leaders fail. Great leaders doubt themselves. Great leaders really lean hard on their teams. And that team not only includes people around them in their company, but typically that team includes a husband or a wife, family members. Right? At their core, although they may not let you see it, great leaders are vulnerable. They hurt, right? And they hurt more because they have to project that things are going well and that they can lead you through it. Right? I think when you look at, I love to use Elon. Elon's become very controversial lately, but I'm going to love him anyway. Elon had Tesla production struggles. He was down to his last few bucks on SpaceX, and he admitted and publicly embraces failure. So when he admits it and publicly acknowledges it, you know that in his heart and in his gut, he's been feeling that pain for a long time. So be careful what you wish for when you think about, man, if I was only in that C-suite, I could really make some changes. Man, being a leader means you're going to hurt and hurt a lot. It means you're going to oftentimes have to do unpleasant things to people you care a great deal about, right? And make decisions that you know are going to get people laid off or give some part of the business away to a partner or something like that. And you're never going to be able to really explain why to those people for a variety of reasons. So that's myth number 2, that leaders are heroic. Myth number 3, and this is kind of a weird one, and maybe it's not so much a myth, but I'm going to call it a myth. Leadership is about you, right? Leadership books all focus on what you need to be a leader. You know, charisma, vision, grit. And there's a few out there, but precious few, that talk about the reality as I see it. And that is leadership is about enabling others, empowering others so that you don't have to lead so much, right? They are self-forming, highly productive people, right? And their success then becomes our success, the leader's success. You know, think about it even as a family unit, right? You work your hardest to grow children that will become self-reliant and virtuous, contribute to the public good. And this is a long leadership journey, right? For some of us, it was only 18 years or so. Both my boys launched fairly quickly. But you never really know whether you're doing the right things, right? You're constantly evolving. And at the end of the day, it's not about what kind of father I was to Jacob and Trent. It was about what kind of person Jacob and Trent was becoming with a little bit of help from me. Right? So leadership is not about you, it's about the led, right? So that's why I say it's kind of a myth, but kind of true. All right. The next little bit I want to talk about is just why leadership books miss the mark so much. And I mentioned a few of these things already. Leadership books oversimplify it, right? They reduce complex human dynamics to checklists or buzzwords, right? Disruption, break all the rules. Why? Because those sell books, not because they help you lead so much, right? And we've talked a lot about this before when we talked a little bit about chaos last year. True leadership, in Tony's humble opinion, really requires navigating ambiguity, right? Dealing with emotions, trading off, this is 51 and this is 49. I'm just not sure which way to go. And then making a decision when there's really no good decisions to be made, right? So the books don't help much with that, unless there's a good portion on ethical dilemmas. That'll help. The second reason is there's something called survivor's bias, right? In these books. First of all, you don't get a lot of books written by failed leaders. We need more of those. Maybe I'll write one of those. Yeah. Confessions of a Leader Who Sucks by Tony Kern. Yeah, or at least who sucked on multiple occasions and failed, right? Leaders tend to cherry pick their successes, right? Some will talk about how we had a failure, but I turned it around and it was a success, right? We study Apple, but we don't really study Enron. Right? We study the people that made heroic growth, but we don't study we study Netflix, we don't study Blockbuster much, right? Most leaders, first of all, aren't in books. They're grinding it out somewhere today, being transactional, right? Making the train stay on the tracks. But we can learn as much or maybe even more from them, right? And there's a lot of leaders that don't hold formal leadership positions, or they do, but they might seem to be insignificant, right? A ninth grade football coach, right? An eighth grade special ed teacher, a stay-at-home mom with 4 kids. Those are really significant leaders, but we're never going to read about the lessons that they learn because A, they probably don't have time to write it, and B, nobody published those books. But maybe those are the leadership lessons we need to look at most, ones that don't have survivor's bias, that cherry pick the successes and don't talk about the failures. Right? And then reason 3 is this whole past tense thing. It's static advice in a dynamic world, right? Books are frozen in time, and that time is past. Some truths are timeless, right? I like to think a lot of the stuff that I write about human error and that I write about professionalism and mental health aspects are pretty timeless because I look pretty hard at the past. And these things were present 100 years ago. And relatively the same issues were surrounding the challenges of error and professionalism and mental health. Now it's changing in terms of technology and pace, but inside us as individuals, pretty stable. So I feel somewhat okay about writing about things that seem to be able to survive the test of time. But a lot of leadership books that you read will tell you that this model works and will always work. Right? An example would be pre-2020. There isn't a book out there that talked about remote work or artificial intelligence. Right? And now you're going to see a whole bunch of them talk about that until that becomes passe as well. So let's finish up here with, in Tony's humble opinion, what does real leadership look like? Forget the rigid frameworks. Principle 1, I guess, would be you have to be adaptable and you can't follow any dogma. When people ask me what kind of leader I am, I say, you mean right now? I'm a listener. Even though I've had, as I've said before, close to $700,000 of leadership training provided to me by the federal government and the private sector, and I own a whole library of leadership books, and I study the heck out of it. At the end of the day, I guess the one thing I would say is that adaptability is the most important aspect of all of it. And, I guess the more you know, the more adaptable you're capable of being. So there's nothing wrong with being aware of all the leadership theories, but I don't think you can buy into any of them. You have to make those decisions on the fly. Right? I think the second principle about what real leadership looks like, especially in small business, maybe not so much where you've got a big architecture around you, but it's a mess and you've got to embrace it. It's not clean. It's not predictable. It's conflict. It's emotional gut punches. It's making tough calls, where you're going to impact people's lives, right? It's dealing with the quirks of a team, right? And trying to figure all that out. And that's also the most satisfying part is that you get to make those decisions and you hope you're one that can make those decisions in such a way that you're getting the best possible outcome for the most people out of the decisions you make. And then I think principle 3 that I'd like to leave us with here is you need to learn from doing, not reading. I love to study. I've been a student my whole life. Books inspire me, right? But they don't grow me much, right? The real growth comes from experience. It comes from failure. It comes from analysis of those failures, the humility that comes with failure that allows you to come back and grow. Okay? And that is probably the last piece I want to leave you with. And that is that you have to be able to take the hit. You have to be able to learn the lesson from the hit. and you have to be committed to coming back stronger and accepting the same kind of responsibilities that caused you that gut punch in the first place. So that's a lot to throw down in 25 minutes or so on why you should never read a leadership book again, which I didn't really say, but it was kind of the overarching principle here. Look for mentors in the real world. Take risks, not the one that's going to get you killed or ruin your company, but a reasonable risk where you could fail because you're going to learn a lot from it. And reflect on every leadership moment you come across, whether it's in your family or in a social setting or environment or for some particular cause you have that's not associated with your profession. And then, of course, all the things within your profession. So as we wrap up here, I'll give you a question or two to think about. What's the best and the worst leadership advice you've ever gotten, right? The best or the worst, maybe and the worst leadership advice you've ever gotten. Second thing, what's the best book on leadership you've ever read? And if you can provide that feedback to me, I'd greatly appreciate it, because obviously I think a lot about this, enough to talk about it, and even offer a few kernels of wisdom to you on the Only Human podcast. So like always, please like, share, follow, subscribe, send this to people that you think could benefit from listening to our quest to grow where we are with what we have in the moment.